Today, the two conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine continue, but there are perhaps more signs now of worries and doubts starting to develop in relation to both of these conflicts, at least in the West. And I get the sense that though there's no real ideas at the moment of how to extract the West from these conflicts, perhaps the most dangerous period in relation to both of these conflicts, the risks of direct Western intervention, are now ebbing away. Anyway, let me begin, as I've been doing in recent programs, with the conflict in Ukraine. Now, we are, as I've discussed previously, very much in the period still of the Rasputitsa. I've seen some videos which show the conditions that there are in the fields in Ukraine, in Donbass, in Zaporozhye, and they show these very boggy, marshy conditions, and you see how easy it is for tanks and armoured vehicles, and by the way, even more so for wheeled vehicles to get stuck in them. And there was an illustration of what that can mean, at least so it seemed to me, yesterday in the latest intelligence briefing from the Russian Ministry of Defense. The Russian Ministry of Defense gave, as it usually does, updates about the state of the battle in various places. It scarcely ever talks about territorial retreats or advances. What it basically does is that it gives a list of where Ukrainian forces are suffering casualties and the number of those casualties according to the Russians. And by general consensus, the numbers of casualties that the Russians claim to be inflicting on the Russians has declined recently. That the Russians are claiming that they've inflicted on the Ukrainians has declined recently, almost certainly reflecting the conditions of the Rasputitsa and the fact that the fighting is declining in intensity. Avdeyevka being, of course, the exception. But anyway, fighting does still take place, losses do still happen, and as I've said many times, the actual numbers of losses, manpower losses, that the Russians attribute to the Ukrainians, they may be reasonably correct ballpark estimates, but I've never said that they are fully 100% reliable. But by contrast, I do think that the armoured vehicle and tank losses, the losses of equipment that the Russians describe in their regular intelligence bulletins, that those are roughly true. So over a 24-hour period, the Russians claimed that around 20 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or severely wounded in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector of the battlefield. Now, by recent standards, by the standards of this war, this is a relatively light casualty number. But the Russian Defense Ministry also claimed that I think it was 16 vehicles, including, from recollection, 2 tanks, 11 infantry fighting vehicles, 4 other armoured vehicles were destroyed in the Zaporozhye region, in this identical region. So we see a sudden, astonishing discrepancy in the number of armoured vehicles that are destroyed relative to the number of soldiers who have been killed or wounded. And there's a very simple reason for this. What is happening is that tanks and other infantry and armoured vehicles, which have been deployed in offensive conditions and the Ukrainians have still been launching occasional sporadic attacks in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, one of the few places where they do still carry out attacks. Anyway, the Ukrainians have been launching these attacks, and they've been trying to deploy armoured vehicles to support these attacks, and the armoured vehicles got stuck in the Rasputitsa. And in this part of the battlefront, they've had to be abandoned. So the troops exited, the armoured vehicles were left where they were because there's no means to drag heavy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and such things out of the mud. And the Russians, of course, saw them where they were, and they sent their various drones, their Lancer drones and their FPV drones and all those sorts of drones, and their artillery and their other weapon systems, and they destroyed them. They destroyed them where they were, stuck and idle on the battlefield. That is my reconstruction of that particular incident, and it corresponds closely with the reports and information we're seeing from lots of places around the battlefronts. Anyway, to come back to the overall situation, since we are in the period of the Rasputitsa, offensive action continues to take place, but of course it is slow and incremental, and pretty much all of it now is being conducted by the Russians. And we have had the first admission that I'm aware of to that effect from someone on the Ukrainian side of the war. And the person who's made this interesting and important admission is none other than Hanna Maliar. Now, Hanna Maliar used to be a deputy defense minister in the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Minister of Defense. She was a regular commentator on the state of the fighting on the various battlefronts. She gave an awful lot of reports, made an awful lot of claims and reports about the situation in Bakhmut, as I recall, which tended, frankly, to deviate increasingly from the truth. A couple of weeks ago, when the former Ukrainian defense minister, Reznikov, Alexei Reznikov, got sacked and then was packed off to London as ambassador, at around that time, Maliar, who was obviously in some way connected to Reznikov, anyway, Maliar was sacked as well. But anyway, she's still there. She still presumably has some contacts within the Ukrainian military. And she's now given an interview with a website, I believe, called Liga Net. And she has acknowledged that the Ukrainian army is now on the defensive, pretty much across the front line. And she said this: the task of the Russian forces is to exhaust us completely and prepare for some further action. We should be aware of this. The military is aware of this, definitely. And we need to prepare for these things, to understand that we are not only on the defensive now, but we are being systematically exhausted, absolutely, along the entire front line. This is due to many things, but first of all, to two key factors. Our capabilities in terms of manpower and hardware. We are unable to maintain the intensity that would allow us to do what needs to be done. The Russians have more resources. And she went on to say that while being on the defensive, Ukraine's army is being forced to deplete the weapons the West continues to supply, but which are being handed out by installments. So there you have it. You have an admission from a former Ukrainian deputy defense minister, someone who was in post just a few weeks ago, and she tells us that so far from Ukraine being on the offensive, or so far from Ukraine being on the attack, it is now on the defense. It is finding itself in a war of attrition, which the Russians have imposed upon it, and that the Ukrainians are being exhausted, and that the Ukrainian military understand this, but that they have no real plan or idea of what to do about it. And that, as I said, is from our old friend Hanna Maliar, whom I quoted on numerous occasions, as I remember when she was Ukraine's deputy defense minister and was providing, as I said, running commentaries on the state of the war from the Ukrainian side. Now, it's interesting, of course, that Hanna Maliar says all of this. The message apparently has not got through to some others. Charles Michel is giving us a radically different account of the state of the war. He says he was asked whether he thinks that the Ukrainian offensive has failed, and he responds by saying, "I don't see or think that this counteroffensive is failing, but you're absolutely right. We need to support Ukraine with more capabilities. The current situation shows that we in the EU need to accelerate and increase our production to support Ukraine." So that is Charles Michel. As I said, he and Maliar, and the last, Maliar, of course, is a deputy defense minister. She and he take diametrically different views about the overall direction and state of the war. Now, I have to say, Maliar, I want to make this clear, remains committed to the war from the Ukrainian position, and it's quite clear to me that she is another one of these advocates of mass mobilization in Ukraine. Another thing that she said is that the time for popular solutions has already passed. They have been exhausted. They can no longer exist in such a complex war. We just, as an adult society, must understand these things and not expect that there should be good news every day. This cannot be. And she went along and basically said that Ukraine, therefore, has a long way to go. And along this path, there are some unpleasant things that are sad to realize, but the Russians simply physically have more people. We have a smaller army. It will not be larger. Yes, we have such a problem. We have fewer weapons, and they shouldn't be afraid, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. And to my mind, all of that is a further attempt to soften Ukrainian public opinion for the further huge mobilization or huge attempted mobilization of young people and women, which is still to come. And on the topic of women, there are now more and more videos starting to appear of Ukrainian women fighting in trenches as infantry on the front lines. As I said, this is deeply dismaying for me to see, but it is now what we're increasingly seeing happen during the war as it is now. And if these mobilization plans take effect, no doubt we will be seeing an awful lot more of it. Anyway, that's from Hanna Maliar. Ukraine is on the defensive, and this is not likely to change. The situation with the Rasputitsa means that big offensives, big arrow offensives, are hardly practical. what actually is going on the battlefronts? Well, there was a cascade of news yesterday from the Avdeyevka front lines. It's not always easy, for me at least, to understand what all of this news says. Sometimes it contradicts itself. There's a filtration plant, for example, on the eastern boundary of Avdeyevka, abutting the Russian front lines. The Ukrainians had turned this into a major fortified position. There were claims yesterday that the Russians had captured it. There were other claims from some Russian reporters that those claims that the filtration plant had been fully captured were premature, that fighting for control of it is still underway. I can't say definitely what the truth is, but overall, the commentary, the reporting about the situation in Avdeyevka points conclusively in the same direction. Heavy Ukrainian losses, Russian advances in the south, the Russians having now apparently cleared the industrial region in the south, starting to edge through the dachas, towards the metropolitan area of Avdeyevka. Possibly this filtration plant captured as well. There's more reports now that the Russians are renewing their advances through the village of Stepovoye, towards Berdichi, and along the railway track, and also lots of reports about more Russian attacks in the industrial area to the north, the coke factory, and the industrial facilities around it. With the pressure on the Ukrainians growing all the time, and the Ukrainians having to move troops around within this steadily closing cauldron as they try to push back the Russians, the Russian pincers, which gradually, remorselessly close. And there was a comment also from a Ukrainian telegram channel, from one of the Ukrainian telegram channels I routinely read, which is Resident, and they reported on the mood within the Ukrainian General Staff. And this is taken from Resident. I should say that the translation that I have has been provided by the Slavyangrad website. Anyway, Resident says this: our sources in the General Staff, that's to say the Ukrainian General Staff, said that the situation around Avdeyevka is developing along Bakhmut's path, both in terms of losses and in terms of the senselessness of these losses. In both places, they defend to the last, throwing in more and more reserves at the direction of Bankova. Bankova is the office building from which Zelensky works. It has become a metonym for the political leadership of Ukraine, and in some cases for Zelensky itself. So they've thrown more and more reserves at the direction of Bankova, and the military command has no influence over the situation. Zelensky's opinion is ignored, and the raid has become a political instrument of the president's office. So that is what Resident, which is a Ukrainian telegram channel, is telling us, that Zelensky is ignoring all military advice to pull Ukrainian troops out of Avdeyevka. He's ignoring all military advice that this situation in Avdeyevka is becoming unsustainable. Instead of taking the men out and saving what can be saved, he continues to throw more men. And by the way, in one particular place, women have also been seen. so in the Avdeyevka front lines. So women as well. Throw more and more of them in, where of course the pincers will gradually close around them and these people will be destroyed. And Zelensky's advice, again, is being ignored, as is that of the General Staff as a whole. Now, all of that may be true. It probably is true, actually. But I would again reiterate that it's highly likely that these briefings that we get from places like Resident have been provided by Zelensky himself. And if one thing has become absolutely abundantly clear over the course of this year, it is that Zelensky can very often say one thing in public or communicate to the public one thing, as he probably is through Resident, and he might be saying something completely different in private to Zelensky himself and perhaps to the Western powers who are bankrolling this war. Anyway, speaking of Zelensky, there was a rather interesting fact about him, which is that, as I mentioned briefly yesterday, it was he who turned up to the Ramstein conference in Germany. This is a routine event that happens every couple of weeks where the Western powers and Ukraine's other backers meet and discuss on this airbase in Germany the provision of more aid for Ukraine and try to chart strategies and policies for the way forward. There was that enormously big and important meeting in Ramstein, which took place back in, I think it was January of this year, where all the leaders were present and where the decision was taken to supply Ukraine with tanks, with armoured vehicles, with a view to equipping Ukraine to conduct its summer offensive, the final plans of which were signed off there. So, Ramstein can be an important meeting. It's become, it seems to me, significantly less important over the last few months. And this particular meeting was attended by Zelensky instead of Zelensky himself. I don't myself attach any vast significance to this fact, but some rather interesting things were said by others in connection with this Ramstein meeting. I'm not sure whether all of the people who said it were actually there, but anyway, they did say it. And two things were being said which, if you like, circled around this Ramstein meeting. And two of the comments that have attracted attention was one that was made by the Czech President Pavel, in which he said that Russia is the great enemy of the West, the great enemy of Europe, and that the Europeans need, therefore, that the Western powers, therefore, need to prepare for intensive fighting in Europe itself. And then there was another comment made by a NATO official. This is NATO logistics chief, Zelensky, who talked about the creation of a NATO Schengen zone. And I'll just deal with the Schengen zone idea briefly first. And what Solfrank was talking about is that there should be a military Schengen, an area for the free passage of military cargo across Europe, similar to the political Schengen zone that allows free movement of labour and people across the EU. So that would mean that German military units can move around France without having particular permission. French units can trundle around Germany and do the same. Polish units can trundle around as well. At the moment, the procedure for agreeing the deployments of units is extremely complex and requires the agreement of the political leaderships. If this NATO Schengen idea were ever to bear fruit, it would be a purely military decision taken by military chiefs, and the political leaderships might not be directly involved. And Zolfrank said, we are running out of time. What we don't get done in peacetime won't be ready in case of a crisis or war. We need to be ahead of the curve. We have to prepare the theatre well before Article 5 has been invoked. In other words, they've got to prepare for war. They've got to make all of these arrangements so that armies and forces can move around Europe, and it needs to be done immediately. And this, again, also appears to anticipate an armed conflict in Europe against, well, who else but the Russians? A lot of people have been very alarmed by this comment of Zolfrank's, but I have to make one immediate observation about it, which is that this is nothing new. I can recall first discussions about the creating a military Schengen zone in autumn 2017. That's 6 years ago. And it was, as I remember at that time, floated by none other than the EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini. She was, by the way, seen by many people as a sort of moderate who was looking to improve relations with Russia. Well, she might have been that in some respects, but as we see, she was busy advocating the setting up of a military Schengen zone. Anyway, it was all agreed then, in theory. Everybody in the EU and in NATO signed it off then. And a program set up under the EU's Egypt called the Permanent Structured Cooperation Program was created in order to bring this military Schengen into effect. And, well, nothing much else happened. It all got mired in bureaucracy and political wrangling and all of the usual things. It's just conceivable, I suppose, that this time it will all be different. But to be frank, I am sceptical. I would have thought that some nation states might be unwilling to see foreign armies trundling across their soil without their permission. And for the moment, at least, this whole plan, which supposedly was going to be implemented 6 years ago, was to be the start of implementing it 6 years ago. This whole plan has come to naught, and we see Mr. Zolfrank is getting very unhappy about it and is trying to revive it. But from what I can tell, it isn't receiving much political traction. What I will say is this: all this talk about military Schengen zones and getting the EU to participate in creating them, what it is going to do, if it continues, is that it's going to change Russian perspectives, not about NATO, but about the EU. Until fairly recently, President Putin of Russia has been saying that, Russia has very strong objections to NATO expansion, but it isn't so bothered or concerned about EU expansion. He's even spoken about the fact that if Ukraine chooses to join the EU, which he says is a purely economic association, well, then that is not Russia's business. But we see that with all this talk about political Schengens, with the creation of permanent structured cooperation programs intended to expand and bolster European transport infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, tunnels, ports, airports, and to make all of these available for the military to move around. Well, the Russians, seeing all of that, inevitably are going to start to say to themselves, well, actually, the EU isn't an economic association at all. It is simply another part of the North Atlantic Alliance. And of course, they would be right to. I get the sense that Putin himself is becoming increasingly isolated within Russia when he continues to speak about the EU as a purely economic arrangement. I don't think many other senior Russian officials agree with him, and I suspect that before long, even he's going to change his views. Anyway, that was one of the comments that was made by a Western official in connection with this meeting in Ramstein. The one that has attracted more attention is the one by President Pavel. And I think this needs some understanding, because when President Pavel, who is of course the President of the Czech Republic, talks about Russia being the great enemy, and we need all to prepare for that, and to prepare for a possible war in Europe, what he's actually doing is that he's talking to the United States. He's addressing the Americans, and he is addressing General Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, in particular. Now, when Lloyd Austin went to Kiev a couple of days ago and met Zelensky, when he announced his package of weapons for Ukraine, his latest $100 million package for Ukraine, Lloyd Austin said that one of the reasons, in fact, the reason why the United States needs to continue to support Ukraine is because if the Russians win, that will embolden China in the Pacific. And it was pretty obvious that as far as Lloyd Austin was concerned, it is China that remains the great adversary. Now, the Europeans feel otherwise. For them, China is far away. It is not a direct military threat to them. China might be in military competition with the United States, but it is not, by any conceivable measure, a military challenge or threat to Europe. And Lloyd Austin's comments play into the perennial fear that the Europeans have had basically ever since NATO was created in the 1940s, which is that at some point the United States will lose interest in Europe, will refocus its energies on other things, either on its domestic problems or on its other external challenges in places like the Pacific, and will downgrade its support and its investments in Europe and start to pull its forces out of Europe. And conceivably, and this for some Europeans would be the greatest nightmare of all, might even come to some sort of deal with the Russians about Europe, which cuts the Europeans out. Now, there are perhaps some European leaders who would not be too concerned if the Americans left. But the current European political establishment, which has committed itself totally to the Atlanticist cause, for them that is a nightmare. It would mean that they would find themselves potentially in a situation where they'd provoked and infuriated the Russian bear, which might be on the prowl in their western borders, or so they would see it. And of course, the Americans, who have up to now reliably kept the bear at bay, have gone away, leaving the Europeans to deal with this angry bear by themselves. That, I can say definitely, is how some European leaders, including President Pavel himself, I suspect, think about these things. So they need to try to keep the Americans focused on Europe, not overly worried or concerned about China, not distracted by other things. So that is what Pavel's comments, in my opinion, are ultimately all about. And of course, there's other things going on which must be worrying the Europeans as well. The Europeans are able to read the American media just in the same way that I can. They're reading these articles in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy and the National Interest by people like Thomas Graham, Richard Haas, Michael Blackburn, and all of the others. They know about the fact that the Council for Foreign Relations has been trying to engage the Russians in some sort of a dialogue over Ukraine. They know that increasing numbers of people in the United States are becoming frustrated and impatient with this unwinnable war in Ukraine. Those are the words of Samuel Charab, also of the Council for Foreign Relations and of the RAND Corporation. And this, of course, plays in again to European worries that the Americans might decide to cut a deal with the Russians about Ukraine and about the general security situation in Europe over the Europeans' heads, over the Ukrainians' heads, leaving them all out in the cold. So again, you get the sense of the nervousness from people like Pavel, and that is what explains, in my opinion, his words. And it is interesting that Pavel is talking publicly in this way, and his comments, in my opinion, should be seen, therefore, not so much as showing the aggressiveness and belligerence of the Europeans towards Russia, but rather more as showing signs of the increasing nervousness and fear as they start to sense that the Ukrainian war is being lost, and as they also sense that the Americans are increasingly having their doubts. Now, can I just say that if we follow that line of logic through, we can also see where it leads us, or to be more precise, where it leads the Europeans. Because given that for the Europeans, for people like Pavel and the British government and the current German government and others, given that for them, the overriding priority is to keep the United States in Europe and confronting the Russians. From their point of view, a deal between Russia and the United States is the worst possible outcome, even if that deal is limited solely to the topic of Ukraine, because it must inevitably have a bigger impact on the situation in Europe. From their point of view, better keep the war going, even if it means that Ukraine is completely defeated and entirely destroyed, than have the Americans negotiate a settlement with the Russians. At least if there is a conclusive military defeat in Ukraine, the Europeans can tell the Americans, look, the bear is indeed on the prowl. It is indeed looking hungrily at Europe. We therefore urgently need you to stay, and it would be a disaster for you if you don't. I'm not saying that all Europeans think this way. Others perhaps think differently. There are no doubt growing voices in Europe as well, in the corridors of the various chancelleries, who are saying that this is turning into a total disaster and a shambles in our own interests. On the contrary, rather than escalate this crisis, we need to try ourselves, if the Americans can't do it, to find some way out by talking to the Russians. But those who want things taken in a different direction, in the more apocalyptic direction, if you like, people like Pavel, well, they most emphatically do exist, and I suspect overall that they remain in control. So anyway, that was a long discussion about what's been happening in Ramstein and in Europe, but it doesn't change the direction of travel on the battlefronts. The pressure on Avdeyevka is growing. The Ukrainian General Staff, we're reliably told, is in despair about Avdeyevka and is in despair about what they see as the misconceived strategies that Zelensky continues to force upon them. And they're looking elsewhere on the battlefronts, and again they're seeing things going badly wrong. Now, yesterday, Rybar, one of the Russian reporting channels, claimed that in the Kherson region in Krinky, the Ukrainian soldiers who are still there have mounted some kind of a counterattack. I don't take that counterattack particularly seriously. Dima at the military summary channel thinks that it's a symptom of desperation on the part of the Ukrainian troops in Krinky, as they feel that the vice is closing around them, and as the bombing and shelling of Krinky becomes unbearable, that they're trying to expand their bridgehead in order basically to find more places to hide. That may very well be true, by the way. But anyway, there was that event in Krinky, but everywhere else things are going badly for Ukraine. And we have reports that the Russians have made more progress finally in Marinka itself. There's now apparently only a few hundred meters left of Marinka to clear. That they have also are coming very close now to capturing this village south of Marinka, known as Novo-Mikhailovo. There's been quite a lot of fighting around this village. Again, why it is important, it's not clear to me, but there are plenty of people who discuss this, military people who discuss this, and you can go to them and they can no doubt explain it. And, of course, in Avdeyevka, the situation is catastrophic, and there were more reports yesterday that after a pause caused by the Rasputitsa, the Russians are on the move again around Bakhmut, that the two forces on the flanks, the one in the Kleshevka area and the other in the Berkhovka reservoir area, that they're now pushing forward and that they are advancing. Well, that may all be true. In fact, I've no doubt it is. But the important thing to understand is that even as the situation on the actual battlefronts is going increasingly against Ukraine, the reports about what is coming out of Russia, or what will eventually come out of Russia, must be deeply disturbing for the Ukrainian military, for the Ukrainian General Staff, because over the last couple of days, there's been a number of statements in Russia, including from people connected to the Duma, the Russian parliament, and they are now talking about the fact that by 2025, in other words, a year from now, towards the end of 2024, 2025, the Russians will have 1.5 million men, trained professional soldiers, fully trained professional soldiers in their military, able to conduct military operations on the battlefronts. And Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, he's now said that the total number of men who have enrolled in the Russian military this year, that's to say in the Russian professional army and also in the various volunteer forces, that they now number 410,000 men that they've already enlisted, which suggests that the Russians are going to exceed their target of enlisting 420,000 men by the end of this year. So that does put the Russians on track to have a total army of 1.5 million men. I'm not entirely sure of exactly how big the Russian army currently is. Reports suggested that it was around 800,000 men at the time when the conflict in Ukraine began in 2022. But that included conscripts who are who serve exclusively on Russian territory. Most reports, I recall, suggested that in 2022, the Russian forces in Ukraine numbered at most, until the big call-up in the autumn, that they numbered around 200,000 men in total. And that number declined, as I've discussed many times, in the summer, in August, when contract soldiers were allowed to quit after the expiry of their 6-month contracts, a policy which has now been reversed. Anyway, the Russians called up 300,000 men. These were reservists in the autumn of last year, something which stabilized the front lines. These were, as I've said, overwhelmingly people who had been recently serving in the military, sometimes just weeks before, and so training them was hardly necessary to any great extent. The 420,000 plus that are going to join up in the Russian military this year, these are apparently additional troops. So if we say that there were 300,000 men joining the Russian military over the course of 2022, and that the Russian forces perhaps numbered around 150,000 men at the time of the call-up, and if we add to that the various volunteer forces that have also been called up, and the fighters from the Donbass militia who've now been enlisted in the Russian army, I would guess that all of these people taken together, with the 420,000 who have been joining the Russian military this year, would give us a total force at the start of this year of perhaps around 900,000. Not all of them on the battlefronts, obviously. At the moment, the Russians are not deploying anything like those sort of numbers on the battlefronts. Many of the men who were called up this year are still training, and their training is going to continue for much of 2024. But anyway, we can start to see the size of the forces that are being gathered. And if it is indeed the Russian plan to put together a force of 150,000 men, 1.5 million men, and to have this combat ready by the start of 2025, then that suggests that the Russians are going to continue to enlist men through much or perhaps most of 2024 as well. So a huge army is being assembled in Russia. Now, I know that there are some people in the West who are skeptical about these Russian enlistment claims. Michael Kaufman, War on the Rocks, for example, says that these Russian enlistment claims are exaggerated, even though he does accept that the Russians have been enlisting large numbers of people. I don't know why he thinks that they are exaggerated. I've actually had private reports from various sources that have proved reliable in the past. One in particular, which has proved extremely reliable in the past, which says, on the contrary, that the true number of people who are enlisting in the Russian army is actually being understated, that it is greater than the Russian authorities are disclosing. Just so. I personally think that at the very least, the Russians will indeed call up 420,000 men this year, and I suspect that they could continue to call up an awful lot more next year if they needed to, and that we might indeed have a 1.5 million man army by the end of the year 2024, if that is what the Russians decide to do. The only limiting factor, in my opinion, is not availability of men willing to join the Russian army, able and willing to join the Russian army, and of the right fitness and health levels and age levels to join the Russian army in Russia. It is that increasing recruitment on this scale at a time when there is already a severe labour shortage in Russia is going to create more stresses within the domestic economy. But I've already discussed in previous programs, and we've had a discussion about this on the Duran, that I think the Russians do have a potential solution for this, which is to recruit guest workers from Central Asia, and conceivably perhaps from North Korea, and possibly even China and Iran and Turkey and such places, to fill in any gaps in the industrial and workforce that this massive enlistment exercise is creating. So, 1.5 million men, and even if people like Michael Kaufman perhaps don't want to acknowledge the reality of this, I suspect that the Ukrainian General Staff are becoming increasingly alarmed about this. What they're telling their Western sponsors about it, of course, is another matter, but I suspect that privately they're becoming increasingly worried about this, and that is why or so it seems to me, given the absence of negotiations, given the absence of any discussions, they want to move entirely onto the defensive to try to conserve whatever remaining forces they have, and why they want Zelensky to order this mass mobilization of young men, of teenagers, and even of women. So, there we go. The problem for the military is that, of course, Zelensky and the civilians around him are very nervous, are very unwilling to do any of the things that the military want. They're not prepared. He's not prepared to go on the defensive, as we've seen. He still wants the offensive to continue. He's possibly the person who's been insisting on these cross-river assaults in Kherson region. That I personally think that was probably agreed months ago by Zelensky with Milley and Radikin at that meeting that took place in an area which most people think was in Lvov. But anyway, he's certainly pushing, Zelensky has certainly been advocating more attacks by the Ukrainian forces in places like Zaporozhye region, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. We saw all of these armoured vehicles destroyed there. He's also the person behind the Ukrainian attack on Gorlovka. We saw that the Ukrainian military initially opposed Zelensky's orders for an attack on Gorlovka. We were told all about this in Time magazine. He nonetheless insisted on the attack on Gorlovka, and it duly took place. And as far as I can tell, it has achieved nothing. And he is doing, according to Resident, exactly what the General Staff are advising against. He is continuing to deplete. He's continuing to fritter away Ukrainian reserves by pouring them into Avdeyevka, repeating what happened in Bakhmut, though in an even worse form, and making it impossible for the Ukrainians to establish a proper defense line somewhere further west. So he is ignoring them in terms of the actual day-to-day conduct of the war. He's at odds with the military on the actual conduct of the war. And so far, at least, he is balked at publicly announcing this mass mobilization. Now, I understand that in practice, intensifying mobilization in Ukraine is indeed taking place. We've seen the women starting to appear on the battlefronts. That does suggest that more and more of them are being pushed to join up. There might be encouragements on them to join, but there might also be increasing pressures on them to join. But you can only do so much by stealth, and I suspect that Western officials and Ukrainian generals are becoming increasingly exasperated by Zelensky's hesitancies and prevarications on this issue. And going back to that comment by Hanna Maliar, which I discussed earlier in this program, the one in which she conceded that the Russians have the bigger military, that they are more powerful, that they're on the attack right across the front lines. Well, I said that it looked to me as if she's trying to shape the mood in Ukraine for this mobilization of young people and women. And given the fact that she was previously a deputy defense minister, I can't help but think that she's reflecting the opinions of the top military leadership, of Zelensky and people like that. and perhaps was even put up to do it by them. Well, we'll see what happens. I've made my own feelings about this mobilization absolutely clear. On this one issue, I find myself actually agreeing with Zelensky. I think that if he really is hesitating on ordering this mobilization, he is absolutely right. I think it is a disastrous idea at every level. The idea of throwing teenagers and women into battle against a Russian military, which is becoming increasingly proficient, increasingly well equipped, increasingly well organized, and increasingly large in number with professional soldiers, is a disastrous idea. But I suspect that the pressures on Zelensky are so great that sooner or later, that is what he is going to do. Well, in the meantime, as I said, the fighting goes on. I've seen others now suggest that the situation in Avdeyevka is deteriorating so fast that despite Zelensky's best efforts, it's likely that Avdeyevka itself will fall to the Russians before the end of the year. I understand that there are some Russian soldiers who think the same thing. They may be right. Given the way that Zelensky insists on Avdeyevka being defended, the psychological effect of that defeat, especially if it happens so quickly, will be all the greater. And of course, if the Russians push forward in other places, if having taken Avdeyevka, they then start to clean up other places in southern Donbass, places like Marinka, whose fall now looks all but inevitable, at this village of Novo-Mikhailovo, whose importance I don't fully understand, and conceivably Vuhledar as well, well, then the shock is going to be greater still. And if the Russians are able to push forward in the Bakhmut area and start taking villages like Khromovo and Bogdanovka and regain full control of Klishevka, which is now being fought over, and then advance further west still and take Chasov Yar, all of this within, it seems to me, the realm of the possible. I'm not predicting it's going to happen. And if what Russian soldiers on the front lines near the Kupiansk area also think, that they appear to believe that at some point over the next couple of weeks, Kupiansk, at least the eastern part of Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River, will also be taken. Well, if all of that happens over the course of the winter, and if the Russians do begin some big missile offensive supplementing their drone offensives over the course of the year, then I think that there's a real risk that morale in Ukraine will start to crumble, which will, of course, make presumably any mobilization exercise even harder. But there we are. That, it seems to me, is the course of the war. We've seen from the Ramstein discussions that in Europe, at least, those with the power to change direction, to try to seek a negotiated settlement, they don't seem to be interested in doing that. I'm increasingly getting the sense that they would rather see a total defeat in Ukraine than a negotiation, especially a negotiation which involved the Americans. And in the United States, Richard Haass and company still conducting their own negotiations with the Russians. They still talk about the need for some kind of pause, if nothing else, to the war. But they're not coming up, so far as I can tell, with any realistic proposals on how that is to be done, and nothing that they are proposing at the moment is such that the Russians would find attractive. There is a possibility, and there are commentaries, some commentaries apparently in the Russian media discussing this, that once the situation takes a decisive turn, once Avdeyevka falls, and perhaps once Marinka and Vuhledar and all of these other places fall, once the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians firmly back from Bakhmut and have perhaps taken Chasiv Yar, perhaps when they've also taken Kupiansk, it's possible that the Russians, with their forces building up and with the crisis in Ukraine, that the Russians might make their own peace proposal, that they might suggest to the Americans at that point some sort of negotiation. I don't exclude that possibility at all. There have been even some Russian commentaries talking about a new Yalta, and as I discussed about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, Putin has made some statements about the territories that the Russians might be interested in Ukraine, which could be seen as possibly providing a position that the Russians might take in negotiations, which, for all I know, they might choose to initiate. But for the moment, the Russians, it seems to me, are concentrating on the war. And they're logically right to do that, and they will nonetheless, and they will, of course, no doubt, continue on that course. So there we are. That is the state of the war in Ukraine today. Now, I'm going to say much less today about the situation in the Middle East. In fact, I'm only going to turn to it briefly. The ceasefire that we've spoken about, the one that was negotiated via Hamas and Egypt, and which both Israel and Hamas have agreed to, that ceasefire is now apparently in effect. It will be interesting to see whether it holds for the 4 days it's supposedly limited to. It will be interesting to see if it is further extended to the full 10 days that the Israeli cabinet has authorized. It will be interesting to see what further steps the various countries in the Middle East decide, what steps they decide to take, and whether they will make any further moves in the UN Security Council. In the meantime, I wanted to comment on a fine article, I believe it was in Al-Mayadeen by Alistair Crook, who, as I've said many times, is far more knowledgeable about this conflict than I am. And I think that Alistair Crook absolutely correctly spoke in this article about the very difficult relationship that now exists between the Biden administration and the Israeli cabinet, that there is now an increasing divergence of interests. The United States, the administration specifically, under significant domestic pressures in the United States in an election year. The election is now less than a year away, and also facing mounting international pressure in the Middle East, wants to dial the conflict in the Middle East down. In fact, I've now read somewhere reports that the administration has sent 3 messages, as many as 3 messages to the Iranians. Apparently these are written messages sent to Iran through intermediaries, assuring the Iranians that the United States is not intending to attack Iran and that they do not want an escalation of the war. So I think that is true of the dominant faction at the moment in Washington. Doesn't mean it will be true always. But for the moment, I think that the administration, Sullivan, Blinken, and perhaps Biden himself, have looked at the situation and have concluded that their interests are best served by a dialing down of the conflict. And that may mean a prolonged ceasefire in Gaza, and it might mean also moving towards some sort of new negotiated outcome, or at least suspended outcome to this current conflict. So that, I think, is indeed what the current administration currently wants. Whereas Netanyahu and his officials, having been encouraged by the Biden administration right at the start of these events, recent events in October, to believe that they have carte blanche to do whatever they wished, and having been led into a military response in Gaza, are finding it very, very difficult to draw back. They're conscious of the way in which Israeli opinion has hardened and has been inflamed by recent events. And Netanyahu himself is conscious of the brittleness of his own coalition and of the demands by some people within the coalition to actually expand the war by taking in Hezbollah in the north as well. So I think Alistair Crook is absolutely correct about this, and this divergence is indeed there, and I think it is growing. I have one point of difference with Alistair Crook, which is that he speaks about this, and he also, and I agree with him, suggests that the diplomatic initiative in this conflict has slipped out of US control, that the United States is becoming increasingly reactive. We saw that in the discussion, the readout the White House has published of the discussion between President al-Sisi of Egypt and President Biden of the United States, which I discussed in my program yesterday, and about which, by the way, we have done a specific program on the Duran itself. One point where, as I said, I don't agree with Alistair Crook is that he discounts the significance of any Security Council or General Assembly resolutions, mandatory resolutions, if they are eventually passed. He has made he makes the entirely valid point, which many, many people make, that Israel has, in the past, shown a readiness to disregard such resolutions, and the Israeli ambassador, following the last resolution that the Security Council passed, all but said, in fact, he straightforwardly said, that Israel is simply going to ignore that particular resolution. Though it perhaps ought to be said that that resolution was ultimately about humanitarian pauses, and in fact, we have seen that a humanitarian pause is, at the moment, actually in effect. So just say, I think that this time things are different. We have, in effect, a united Arab world. We never had that during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Arab world was deeply divided between countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union, Syria, Iraq, South Yemen, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, the so-called rejectionist states, and the countries, basically the Gulf monarchies and the other more conservative Arab states, which Western commentary of that period like to call the moderates. Anyway, the Arab world was divided, and there were massive tensions between Arab states. The Syrian government was at massive odds with the Iraqi government. There were conflicts between the Saudis and President Nasser in Egypt. All of that was going on at that time. This was during the Cold War. And then after the end of the Cold War, we had a period, the unipolar period, of overwhelming American strategic dominance in the Middle East and everywhere else. So that, of course, Israel had the safeguard of the unqualified backing at that time of the United States, and the United States was in such a dominant position in the Middle East that it meant that, provided the Israelis had got the green light from the Americans, they were basically able to act as they wanted. I don't think that is the case anymore. I think the Middle Eastern states are much more united and much more at peace with each other than they have ever been. The power of the United States itself is waning. And of course, the United States is less united on this issue than it was in the past. If there were a mandatory resolution through the Security Council or the General Assembly, then I think there would be major political consequences for the US if Israel simply ignored it. And I'm not saying that Israel won't try. I'm not even saying that the United States might not back Israel if they did. But I don't think it would be the same as it was before. And I think this has been one of the major problems in both US and Israeli policy over the course of this crisis. I think that neither the US government nor the Israeli government, and especially not President Biden, understand the extent to which things in the world have changed. That we're no longer in a situation where the United States ultimately always got what it wanted, and where its power was so overwhelming relative to everyone else that there was never any real point of expecting that it could be made to change its views. Very difficult though it is for the Biden administration, and especially for President Biden himself, to accept, and more difficult though it is for some people perhaps in Israel to expect. The diplomatic and geopolitical balance has shifted with the result that what now happens in the Security Council and in the General Assembly matters to a degree that it has never done before. Anyway, those are my opinions. Be interested to see what Alistair Crook or others have to say about that. But this is where I end my video today. A lot more things going on. No doubt tomorrow I will be returning to the subject of Geert Wilders' shock victory in the Dutch parliamentary elections. Things, by the way, there are turning out pretty much as I expected. It looks like, despite the fact that he is the clear winner in the election, he's not going to be allowed to form the next Dutch government. But anyway, I will discuss that further in my next programme. And you should also look out, because Alex Christoforo and I have also had a discussion about it on the Duran too. And there's lots going on elsewhere in the world, which I will no doubt also turn to. But to repeat again, this is the end of my video today. So, more from me soon. In the meantime, just to remind you that you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, buy the amazing things that you find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. More from me soon.